As requested, I'll be showing you brushwork for making textured gradients, regardless of what brush you use. Photoshop, Procreate, doesn't matter. We're learning the fundamentals. First, let's talk about what a textured gradient is. This is a sharp edge and this is a soft edge. And a textured gradient is fundamentally something in between these. If we zoom out, we have an overall impression of softness, but it's actually made up of these subtle color shifts and value shifts, but they still have these sharp edges. Even this over here, which feels a lot softer, is ultimately made up with these subtle color shifts and value shifts, but the edges themselves are quite sharp, which gives it some texture. It has an impression of softness, but it's made with sharper edges. And we're going to start with the round brush before we get into more texture. With my round brush selected, I will choose the shadow shade and fill this in with firm pressure. I want to make sure that there's no canvas showing through underneath. And I'll do the same for my lights, even overlapping the two shades just a little bit. And now we need to mix colors that go in between these. So if I pull up the color wheel and compare these two shades, we can imagine that there's a line that goes in between these. And if I pick something in the middle, I'll find a middle value. But we also have to account for the hue because we're going from yellow into purple, and the middle of that is red. And then I'm going to bend the saturation just a little bit, and I'm going to put this up here. That way I can always access this again. So I'm going to take this now, and I'm going to let this be a little chunky, changing up the angles of my brush so that the shape itself is going to begin to dissolve this edge. If I have everything be really kind of banded, it looks really streaky, which might be what you want, but probably not. So we're going to avoid doing that. Now, if I take this same color and start to use less pressure with my brush and start pushing in, you can see that we're having a saturation issue. This is getting very gray in here, which we don't want. So I'll undo that, and now let's mix a color to go in between these. Color wheel, once again, look for that line, find a value in between, but then we can increase the saturation to help that bend, but we also need to bend the hue as well. So it could be something like that, and then we'll do the same between these two. Something around here, then the saturation, lean it towards purple. Now let's just compare how all these look to each other. Do we have an arc appearing? This bumps out a little bit more than I want. So I'm going to take this and take some of the saturation out of it, fill this back in. I can check this once again. Do I have a clean arc from color to value? And it's looking pretty good. So now I can select this one and push this in, firm pressure to start, and then this one, firm pressure. And now, as long as these are close enough, I can take one of these shades and with gentle brush pressure, I can start to create a pressure grade. And I can continue to keep my shapes modeled. I can change the angle of my brush in different directions just to break up the shapes, not just the pressure. So I have more pressure in here, which I could build up with multiple strokes, and I have less pressure out here. If I need, I can grab this again to help create more of a grade, trying to just dissolve the edge just between these with only these two shades. I'm only picking from here. Could take this, start to dissolve this one. Could also take this and push back in until that edge starts to fade. Same with this one. You can see how sometimes you can start to lose the original shades that you had, which is why it's really nice to have these. So this is almost buried underneath everything. So I'll take this, put it back in. I can do that with firmer pressure and then release pressure as I get further away from it. I'm being very careful not to take this shade and put it over here. See how gray that just got? Now, it's important that you're not just following the steps mindlessly, but that you actually have a goal in mind. The goal is to have a gradient that looks soft from a distance, but it needs to be made up of these sharp edges. So the rule is that you can mix any color that goes in between, but you may not use the blending tool. So if I'm struggling to get something that goes nicely between these, I can simply return to my color wheel as needed. Maybe something in here can go in between. Maybe this needs a little bit of help as well. Push this up towards yellow, change the hue, and put that down. You might be thinking that this is a very tedious way to paint, and it is. There are faster methods to impart texture as you build up a painting or put final textures at the end. Let me know in the comments if that's a video that you want to see, not just when to put texture in, but also where and why I feel like is not talked about enough. Now, it is beneficial if you try to make as soft of a gradient as you can, even if you might prefer having more texture, just because this is a great exercise in brush control. So this is looking good enough. I think it's got a very nice overall impression of softness. The big takeaway here is that it's really your colors and values that make the transition. Now let's make a gradient with multiple brushes. So I'm going to start with the inking brush from the Classic library because it gives me full opacity when I lay it down and it can cover very quickly. And now for my brush, I'm going to start with the Procreate Brush Platypus. And with these new brushes, it's very important that you have all the color jitter, color dynamics turned off, as well as any burnt edges. That way you can always be choosing the correct color and there's not going to be variation and confusion there. And I'm really going to be paying more attention to the size of my brush. And this is a very experimental process, but the idea is really going to be the same. And you can see I'm even like fading away a little bit. So my brush is up against the iPad and then I'm kind of backing up as I put my stroke down. So I can start with firm pressure and then release, firm pressure, release, in order to get these more textured marks. And every brush is going to be different, but this one seems to create a nice soft texture. So if I push down a little bit harder, it tends to mix a little bit more for something really soft. But if I want to be more delicate and kind of do a stroke down, it can do that. Obviously this is the wrong value, the wrong spot, so I'm going to pick this again. So the idea, the concept is the same, and the application is necessarily changing with the brush that you're wielding. I can create a whole bunch of variation as I want, but this is a little too much. It's going to fracture the impression of a gradient. I find that it's easiest to start with soft edges first and then try to impart the texture afterwards. And I'm thinking I can mix a color between these. We'll find the line, pick something in the middle, increase the saturation just a little bit. So this should suffice, and now I can lay this in for a better color. So we're trying to achieve that overall soft edge, and this could suffice for a textured gradient in the right context. Let me soften this down and see if I can impart texture on top of it. And now let's choose a new brush. So I'm going to choose Moriarty, which I've already made sure there's no color jitter. I'm going to rock this a little bit more back and forth, see what we get. So I'm just kind of doing this motion, just going in little circles almost. So you can see how these very textured brushes can help you quickly achieve the texture that you want, but you have to focus then even more on creating that gradient and that illusion of softness. Now, if you're struggling to make these gradients, there's probably one or both of these two reasons: color picking and brush pressure. If you're struggling with the color picking, then try using colors that are much closer to each other. You can see that these on the color wheel are very similar hue, even though they're different values. This one took me a long time because I had to mix so many colors. Now, if you're struggling with your brush work, then I recommend you return to the round brush, fill this in with full pressure to practice pressure grades. So this time we're going to take a light shade that is not too far away from the shadow shade. You can put this down with full pressure and work your way across this rectangle and try to slowly release pressure as you go and drop off before you get to the end. And so you can practice this again and again. You can see that this is pretty streaky. Maybe if I try, so I'm going in these more rounded brush strokes to create a more cloudy gradient. Maybe I need to do multiple passes. The goal is to create a gradient. Never forget that that's the goal, and I'm only selecting between these two colors. Let's play with some very different texture. I'll return to my platypus brush, full pressure to start, and now let's see if I can make a few more scragglies for perhaps a grassy texture. And I'm still trying to drop off my pressure as I go. Maybe do a little bit more stippling. Hopefully you can hear the sound of the iPad to create more of a grassy texture. But the goal is always, does this achieve a gradient overall from a distance? Hopefully this video is giving you the fundamentals so that you're not relying on cheap blending effects or taking shortcuts. As I said, there are faster ways of making textured gradients as you build up a painting. But if you learn this well, if you practice these well, you'll always have a foundation to lean on. Thanks for watching.